The next speaker, Professor Gennadii Korolov, affiliated with the Tadeusz Manteuffel Institute of History. His academic career, was strongly affiliated with the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. He had some research trips, and he was a visiting professor at with the Ukrainian Research Institute and in the Slavic Eurasian Research Center in the Hokkaido University. His research interests include the history of idea, the history of historiography, the history of the federalism in the Eastern and Central Europe. And today he's going to present us the topic entitled Historical Poland, the Russian World, and Ethnographic Ukraine, Reconstruction Spatial Concept in the Ukrainian Intellectual Thought, 1848-1918. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for Professor Szumski for the introduction. And in my paper, I broadly discuss the Romantic nationalism era, as the 19th century epoch was characterized by the famous Polish philosopher Andrzej Walicki. Essentially, the main characteristic of the time was the Romantic understanding of history, when the Polish nation was understood not from ethnographic and linguistic positions, but as a political community of nation and spirit. This understanding of the Polish nation is important for my analysis because it demonstrates an opposite perception to that propagated by the Ukrainian national movement at that time. For Ukrainians, as a nation was above all a community united by common language, culture, and territory. This approach could help me to show the evolution of the concept of the Ukrainian socio-political lexicon. And thus I asked the following research question. How did this concept appear and change? When did the meanings radically change? Or conversely, when did they disappear from the scientific and socio-political lexicon? How did the Ukrainian intellectual in the long 19th century define their own ethnographic or national space, which was competing with the Polish and Russian understanding of their spaces? Based on this theoretical framework, I examined the meaning of the three spatial concepts: historical Poland, the Russian world, and ethnographic Ukraine. And thus, my paper's aim is to analyze how this concept emerged, how they acquired new meaning, and why their space of experience erased their original definitions. Importantly, I also sought to define the variability of this concept definition at the moment they acquired meanings around what Reinhard Koselleck defined as the Sattelzeit period. The emergences and subsequent development of the historical Poland, Russian world, and ethnographic Ukraine concept were framed in sediments of several times, especially considering the identification as a part of an ideological lexicon. I chiefly focus on a text of the period's most prominent Ukrainian intellectuals, such as Mykola Kostomarov, Panteleimon Monkulish, Mikhailo Drahomanov, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, Mikhailo Wozinski, and Stepan Rudnitsky. They were united in using the three concepts in their works, albeit in different ways. Historical Poland was first used as a concept to explain Polish territorial claims to Ukrainian Belarusian lands by Mykola Kostomarov. He understood this concept politically and ideologically rather than scientifically. In his essay in 1877, Essay for Poles Peacemakers, Kostomarov wrote that Poles' political ideal was to restore their state as it existed before 1772. Before the first partition of it, this is what they were constantly talking about. Later, Kostomarov proposed a definition of historical Poland as the lands of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth within the 1772 borders. Notably, for him, the concept of Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were identical and synonymous. Historical Poland appeared in his text due as his intention to present Polish history as an antithesis and to and competing narrative with the concept of the Russian history. Therefore, his arguments aim to solve this problem, emphasizing the legitimacy of Russia's claims to Ukrainian and Belarusian lands that belong to a common historical space. Mikhail Drahomanov similarly assessed Poland's role. He added Moscow's historical narrative to the Polish account in competing with the Ukraine story. And I quote here Drahomanov, recognition of the limitation of Ukrainian differences obligated scholars to reconstruct the official Polish and Moscow's narratives of the history of Eastern Europe, which logically should have obligated practical politicians to harmonize with them. Drahomanov's thesis was symptomatic in two regards. First, it showed the Ukrainian history narratives' interdependence with the narratives of Poland and Moscow, as well as its irreducible ideological attachment to the ongoing political context. Second, for Drahomanov, Poland exemplified the oppression of Ukrainians on the one hand and embodied the Republican government's model on the other. Drahomanov's historical Poland concept appeared for the first time in an assessment of the January 1863 uprising's goals. In his opinion, the uprising had been defeated because its insurgents' main goal was the restoration of historical Poland. And I quote here Drahomanov, if the uprising had been for the independence of ethnographic Poland, then it would have had more success and fond understanding on a majority of the Ukrainian society. This latter was important from his point of view because it would have allowed the expansions of the territory and people's potential through the uprising. However, as it is well known, neither the Ukrainian movement nor the peasantry supported the Polish uprising. Drahomanov explains this lack of support rather prosaically. Old Poland seen it mainly from the slavery of the peasants, which formed a significant contrast to the freedom of the nobility. Therefore, Proust's question about what Poland was and where its borders lay constantly appeared, pushing the Ukrainian national movement away from the common struggle against Russian imperialism. For Drahomanov, like Kostomarov, historical Poland was Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before its three partitions. At the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century, the meaning of historical Poland changed conceptually. The term was used not only in scientific text, but also in a journal, essays, and political pamphlet. It was even mentioned in a platform of the political parties, for instance, in a platform of the Ukrainian Radical Party. Mikhail Hrushevsky used this term in a strictly negative sense. He pointed to its unambiguous meaning in a Ukrainian political context as a denoting the ideology of Poland's expansion in Eastern Europe. For the realization of these plans, for the fulfillment of these duties to which the Polish public was called by the voice of the ordinary people, it was necessary to seek reconciliation with those masses of people who, being burdened by historical Poland, were it acute resistant to everything Polish. Using this concept, Hrushevsky emphasized the fact of Poland's domination over the Ukrainian people and territory. Even more often, he used the concept in texts concerning the status of Eastern Galicia and Ukrainians' situation there. Eastern Galicia became an example for dismiss all uniate and restorationist Polish plans. And for the old comrades, historical Poland is not enough. The old Poland concept also appeared in his writing in reference to the Polish ethnographic lands, but historical Poland usually suggested as a political Frankenstein's monster that Ukrainians had been defeated. The concept of historical Poland was perceived similarly in Ukrainian socialist circles. Mikhail Lozinski used it as a category of analysis when considering the Ukrainian-Polish accord in Eastern Galicia. For him, historical Poland describes the origin of Polish aristocratic nationalism and embodied of the idea of domination of Ukrainian ethnographic lands. At the same time, Lozinski also used the ethnographic Poland concepts symmetrically with historical Poland, thus questioning Paul's claims of historical rights to lands that, in his opinion, Ukrainians inhabited. In his works, historical Poland served as an ideological ghost the main object of political attacks, because Poles should inculcate less the ideals of historical Poland, contempt and hated for everything that is ours, that protested against our enslavement by historical Poland. In the text of Kostomarov, Drahomanov, Hrushevsky, and Lozinski, two of the most common concepts can be identified as the Old Poland and historical Poland. The first referred to the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was an anachronistic and undeveloped country in which Ukrainians had been oppressed by the Polish nobility and forced to convert to Catholicism, although they still retain their cultural identity. The second notion referred to the political demands and slogans of the Polish liberation movement. It served to generally designate the idea of reviving Polish statehood within the 72 borders. While the old Poland was a rather historical and scientific concept, historical Poland was a notion in ideological lexicon with a pronounced negative connotation and political burden. Historical Poland primarily indicated to Polish liberation movements territorial claims in Eastern Europe. Therefore, in Dragomanov's understanding, even the Kingdom of Poland within its borders under Romanov rule was a historical Poland, not an ethnographic Poland. The Russian world concept appeared quite often in scientific texts of Ukrainian intellectuals of the second half of 19th century in an expansionist and territorial dimension. Originally, it designated the borders of our lands, as well as the territories that the ancient Ruthenians had inhabited. Panteleimon Kulish assumes that the primordial Russian world, united by the language of the Kievan land, covers the lands of its present and future spread. Kostomarov this concept with an even more expansionist meaning. His works treated it as an element of scientific language rather than a category of analysis. According to Kostomarov, the Russian world is a more extensive concept than Old Rus, territorially and historically. For the Kulish and Kostomarov, the Russian world was primarily a spatial concept encompassing a large community of ancient Ruthenians as a single political and cultural community united by one language and religion. In Kostomarov's famous work, Two Russian Nationalities, he considered Ukrainians an integral part of the old Russian world. He understood this world primarily as a community inhabited by Russians and Ukrainians uniting Great Russians or the Northern Eastern branch and Southern Russian nationalities. He was convinced that the Russian world was a chain of distinctive and internally contested parts. However, his inner life broke the outer crust when the identity turned out to be ghostly. Alongside the Russian nationalities that dominated the outside world appeared another Ukrainian nationality which claims to equal civil rights in the realms of speech and thought. In Kostomarov's opinions, the main signs of belonging to the Russian world were faith and the bookish liturgical language. Therefore, he opined the Russian world was the first original space of ancient Russia, which lacked clear political borders. Panteleimon Kulish was convinced that the Ukrainian language's formation was the main factor separating Ukrainians from Russians. He wrote, there were rulers in Russia who looked down on ethnographic Ukraine, which had spread widely among the Russian world, as if it somehow challenged the Tsarist rule with its own language. At the same time, Kulish pointed to a historical and political communality between Ukrainians and Russians. At the same time, these communalities differed from each other culturally. This assessment was based on his strong opposition to Catholicism and the Jesuit order's activities in Eastern Europe. The Russian world concept disappeared from Ukrainian intellectual, scientific, and political lexicon around the end of 1880s. Drahomanov alone used it a few times thereafter as a special concept denoting the lands of the Old Rus. He used the concept in his work with a narrow scientific meaning, devoid of the clear political connotations. In the mid of 19th century, the concept of an ethnographic Ukraine appeared in Ukrainian intellectual thought. Like the previously described concept, initially it was used scientifically and later it served an important political argument. This concept appeared most often in the text of Mikhail Hrushevsky and Stepan Rudnitsky. Both authors assumed that the borders of the Ukrainian nation and the future of the future Ukrainian state should coincide completely with the borders of Ukrainian settlement in the lands where they constitute a relative majority. Rudnitsky wrote that the boundaries separating the territory inhabited by some people we call ethnographic, where the boundaries separating the state territories are political boundaries. From this boundary demarcation, the meaning of ethnographic Ukraine was derived when Ukrainian intellectuals became convinced that in 19th century European history, the state's political borders did not coincide with ethnographic borders. Rudnitsky wrote that the ethnographic Ukraine's borders should serve as a territorial basis for a future independent state. He pointed out Ukrainians had no historical or expansionist claims. In his opinion, a just world order required states' borders to coincide with ethnographic borders. In this aspect, Rudnitsky's thought was unoriginal. Hrushevsky has already voiced identical ideas and interpretation. In 1920, Hrushevsky admitted the following: contemporary representatives of the Ukrainian movement and all those interested in, of course, should take into account and will certainly take into account the fact of Ukrainian ethnographic statics, the presence of a huge continuous colonizing mass and continuous national territory as a circumstances that, along with historical conditions, most expressively determines the future direction of the Ukrainian life and Ukrainian thought. According to Hrushevsky, ethnographic Ukraine would comprise the following territories. In Russia, west of the Dnieper River, provinces of Volhynia, Kiev, Kherson, Yekaterinoslav, part of Lublin, Grodno, Minsk, Bessarabia, and Tavrida provinces east of the Dnieper River, Poltava, Kharkiv, part of Chernihiv, Kursk, Voronezh provinces, and part of the Don and Kuban regions. Austria includes eastern Galicia, a small southern eastern part of the western Galicia, and the northern part of Bukovina. In Hungary, Subcarpathia, more or less significant part of its northern eastern districts. This description of Ukraine's ethnographic borders directly challenge the Polish and Russian views of their own lands and the true meaning of Ukraine. In defining this concept, Hrushevsky, like Rudnitsky, applied the criterion of Ukrainians' numerical superiority and a historical lens of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as well as the Russian and Habsburg empires. For the both authors, the use of the ethnographic Ukraine concept also entailed the heavy political load of proving Ukrainian territorial claims' legitimacy on a scientific basis. Using this concept, Hrushevsky, Rudnitsky, and many Ukrainian thinkers of the time emphasized of the Ukrainian political movement's self-sufficiency. And here is, I have two main conclusions of my talk. The historical Poland, Russian world, and ethnographic Ukraine concept can be analyzed within the framework of Begriffsgeschichte that transcends the dominant practices of national narratives. In this process, unpacking the concept of spaces and territories allows the borders between geographical components, scientific and political meanings, and concepts degeneration into ideological slogans or political rhetoric to be defined. Concepts of territorializing spaces and constructing models of one's own and neighboring competing territories clearly shows the Ukrainian historical lexicon's dependence on the political context. These concepts, histories, reveal how the formation of national consciousness largely depends on a concept of spatial imagination, which play even more significant roles in nation building than language or religion. Ultimately, spatial images are constructed from scientific idioms and reforged in political arguments. Thank you very much for your attention.